This is an overview of the endocrine system. You have roughly up to 50 hormones running through your body at any point in time. Sometimes we'll say somebody is acting hormonal, when the reality is we're all acting hormonal when you can see the amount of hormones that are running through our bodies. Hormone means to put something in movement or motion or to excite. And that's what hormones do, is they're messengers. And these messengers are either amino acids or cholesterol, steroids, that are contributing to the response in conjunction with the nervous system to give it that overall response called homeostasis. Homeostasis is our general equilibrium that we try to achieve, a normal state of range to allow us to survive on a daily basis. So this is an overview of some of the primary endocrine glands. I didn't include in some of the secondary ones because we find hormones that can be produced by the heart, by the thymus gland, by the kidneys. I didn't include those. I included the majority of the ones that we teach from an anatomical perspective at a beginning level. What I've also added is the hormones that they produce, and then what is their impact or what's their target or effect in the body. So let's start with the pituitary because it does the most. And the pituitary, when we look at this, it looks like a cherry gland to me. It looks like a cherry, but as it hangs down, we refer to this as like the master gland along with the hypothalamus. But the pituitary can divide it into two regions, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. Adeno is the anterior pituitary, and I just remember A for A, anterior for adenohypophysis. The neurohypophysis is the posterior half. In the middle, when we look at the histology, there's a pars intermedia, but I have these two major regions. The pituitary does quite a bit, and it's controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is using regulatory hormones to control the pituitary, but it has a lot to do with growth and development or reproduction of our body. One of our primary hormones is growth hormone. What does it do? It's growth of some of our major tissues, including our bones and our muscles. When we look at these are all related to reproduction. So we have prolactin to allow for that apocrine secretion of milk during lactation. When we look at the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, this is referring to how we regulate thyroid hormones. When we look at adrenocorticotropic, we're regulating the adrenal gland, but on the cortex side, which is the outside region of the adrenal gland. And then we get into controlling reproduction. So follicle stimulating hormone, we offer that as FH, and luteinizing hormone is LH. Primarily referring to when we look at uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle of females, and we talk about how the ovaries develop the follicles. We develop those follicles, and luteinizing to prepare the corpus luteum for the uterus for implantation as if fertilization is going to occur on the monthly basis. So you can see pituitary does a lot when it controls the way we grow, the way we develop, and then reproduction as a whole. So that's why we often call it the master gland. The hypothalamus is also sending hormones to the posterior side of the pituitary that we call the neurohypophysis. So remember, the pituitary is two regions, adenohypophysis, but I put neurohypophysis here because the hormones are being made or secreted or synthesized in the hypothalamus, sent down to the posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis. Versus these are created within the adenohypophysis. So within the neurohypophysis, two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, it's also called vasopressin. And this is telling our bodies to keep water. So it's a messaging system to the kidneys. So you can start to see that you have what we call a cascade effect, that you tend to have one hormone talking to another to create some type of impact. So this is an example. It's where you have the hypothalamus talking to the pituitary to go to the kidneys. Oxytocin is a reproductive hormone that we see primary for uterine contractions for the female. We also see this in the male as a reproductive hormone as well, but oxytocin contributes to uterine contractions. During labor and delivery, sometimes a synthetic form of pitocin is used to mimic these hormones to get the uterine to contract. Remember, we said the pituitary talks to the thyroid. Again, a cascade effect. So TSH regulates thyroid hormones. When we get into the thyroid, when we look at our bow tie muscle, That thyroid produces thyroxine and calcitonin. And when we look at those, these hormones contribute to the overall metabolism or growth of our cells. So we see that energy within the cells itself that's contributed by way of thyroxine. Calcitonin is starting to do something that we control that's flowing through our blood. So it decreases the amount of calcium ions that are flowing in our blood, versus we'll have the opposite effect, and we'll talk about negative feedback in this video, but the opposite effect of parathyroid on the posterior side. I have parathyroid that's secreting parathyroid hormone that's increasing the calcium that's flowing through the blood. So this is our first example to where we see a negative impact on each other, but for a common good of homeostasis. So the thyroid produces calcitonin to decrease blood calcium levels, the amount of blood or calcium ions in the blood. And then parathyroid will contribute to increasing it. And so we're talking to now parts of our bone tissue to allow for that production or decrease of calcium to get it inside the bloodstream. When we get into the adrenal gland, there's two regions, the cortex and the medulla. The outer cortex, remember we said, is controlled by ACTH. So from pituitary to the cortex, we are releasing some of our hormones that control sodium. So now we talk about calcium and sodium. Heavy rely on part of our action potentials as well. And then some of our stress hormones, this increases the blood glucose because glucose contributes to the metabolism of our cells. And then medulla, this is interesting because you have the nervous system talking to endocrine system. So it's a neuroendocrine function. So where you have a straight shot from the nervous system that's going straight to the adrenal medulla to contribute to our sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight. So that's our epinephrine or norepinephrine. We often refer that as the adrenaline. And that's coming from the adrenal gland, but specifically at the medulla. Our pineal gland that we see on the posterior side as we move away from the thalamus, the pineal gland secretes melatonin. And melatonin is what's regulating our circadian cycle or sleep-awake cycle. It tells us it's time to wake up, it's time to go to bed. And we do that based on seeing that light. So this hormone will increase at night for the function of sleeping. Some people will take it synthetically to increase their sleep. But that's one of those hormones that gets disrupted if you're part of a daylight savings wherever you live. The daylight savings contributes to mess this process up of our circadian rhythm. So pineal gland. Pancreas. Pancreas is only about 1% endocrine. The rest of it's an exocrine gland for the digestive system, but it's still highly important when we get into talking about how do we control the blood sugars in our body. There's different hormones, but the primary two that we tend to talk about are insulin and glucagon. Insulin will decrease the blood sugar, and we'll talk about that when we look at negative feedback. Glucagon increases the blood sugar. So that pancreas, although it's a small part about endocrine, it's a huge function of our body to control the sugars and how they impact the different systems. And then we get into the reproductive side, that the testes and ovaries. Testes are producing testosterone, ovaries, estrogen, progesterone, and that's primary to develop the sexual characteristics when we think about our secondary sexual characteristics as we get to puberty, but it's also helping with the development of sperm and then the development of our follicle that's stimulated from follicle stimulating hormone and then luteinizing hormone, part of that corpus luteum to prepare the uterus is done through progesterone. So a lot of not only our sexual characteristics, but just the preparation of fertilization and implantation for the growth of an egg if pregnancy were to occur. So there's a lot happening with our different hormones, and this is just a sample of it. The way this typically functions is homeostasis, to create some type of balance. And we do that through a process called negative feedback or a negative feedback loop. Typically, two different hormones are acting against each other, but to create a balance for a common good, which is homeostasis. The example I give you here is if I was to eat, say, a cheeseburger, and what happens is I have an increase of sugar that ends up in my bloodstream from the digestion. So I increase my blood sugar. The hormone that's going to be released is from the pancreas, and that's from insulin. So insulin is secreted, and what it's doing is telling the cells to intake back that sugar, to get it out of the bloodstream so it's not impacting the body. we typically will uptake it in the cells, and we'll do it in the liver and bring in that sugar and hold on to it or break it down, or both. So I use insulin to decrease the amount of sugar that's flowing through the body. The opposite happens if I haven't eaten a cheeseburger for a while. I get hungry. My blood sugar is low. We often refer that you're hangry, that you're hungry, and you're angry, right? Because you're not able to process things as well if you don't have the proper blood sugar in your body. So I have low blood sugar, so the opposite happens is the pancreas will secrete glucagon to tell our cells to release sugar and put it in the blood side, specifically again at the liver, to allow the liver to release that sugar back into our bloodstream to create that equilibrium. So this is a great example of these two hormones negatively impact each other but create a common good of homeostasis. And we call that a negative feedback loop, that it just continuously fights with each other to create a common balance. So our hormone system, when we talk about the endocrine system, these hormones are constantly flowing through our body, and they're in conjunction with the nervous system. And you can see that because the structures are the same. When we did nervous system, we talked about some of these structures and how they impact the body. And then when we look at the hormones, we all have the common good of homeostasis. This is an overview of the endocrine system. We're talking about the endocrine system, specifically the pancreas. And we'll focus on the histology, the microscope side of the pancreas, focusing just on what we call the pancreatic islet, or the islet of Langerhans. And this is the endocrine portion of it, which is only about 1 to 2% of the entire gland. Remember, we've talked about that there's an exocrine gland in the body and there's an endocrine gland in the body. Exocrine is typically a gland that's secreting a product through a duct that goes to a direct product. Good example is my sweat that goes directly to my skin. Versus endocrine is typically releasing a hormone to maintain homeostasis, and it's running through the bloodstream, so there is no direct target except for the cells of those tissues that will accept and understand the signaling from that hormone. So we're focusing on the pancreas from an endocrine standpoint, which is only 1 to 2%. The rest of it is a digestive gland, an exocrine gland. So it makes digestive enzymes that are secreted into the small intestine for the process of supporting digestion. So when we look at a histology slide, the majority of all of this is called pancreatic acini. That's the exocrine function, which is roughly 98 to 99% of all of the actual organ. When we look at the pancreas and the endocrine side, the islet or pancreatic islet or islet of Langerhans is roughly 1 to 2%, and this is maintaining the sugars that we talk about relative to diabetes. Even though it's only 1%, we know it has a high impact on our body, and we need this to maintain homeostasis. I put the two cells that we focus on for this video today, alpha and beta, but when we look inside a pancreatic islet, there's actually 4 types of cells. First, we have alpha, beta, delta, and then they're called PP or F cells. So when we look at alpha, it's referring to the blood glucose. As we increase the amount of blood glucose, meaning the glucose that's going to run through our system by way of the bloodstream. And we do this by stimulating the liver to release a lot of the stored glucose. Versus beta cells are our most abundant ones, and they do the opposite. They're decreasing the amount of blood sugar levels, meaning the amount of glucose that's running through the blood. So they have a negative feedback loop against each other to create that balance of homeostasis. So we have alpha and beta. The other 2 types of cells that we see in a pancreatic islets are first delta cells. Delta cells secrete a hormone, and that hormone's helping to balance our alpha and beta cells. And then lastly, we'll see PP or F cells. The PP stands for pancreatic polypeptide, and that's a hormone that's controlling some of our digestive secretions. But my focus is to talk about the alpha and beta because that's directly related to our diabetes. There's primarily 3 types of diabetes, 1, 2, and then you'll see gestational. So 1 is an autoimmune disorder, more genetic, that's impacting our hormone levels, specifically with insulin. Number 2, diabetes type 2 is our most common, but that's typically related to our lifestyle and how we maintain our bodies. And then lastly, we see this when we have females that are pregnant during gestation, so gestational diabetes, and it's messing up the balance of their sugars. But where we have this control is with alpha and beta cells. So the pancreas is 99% digestive, meaning exocrine. This 1% pancreatic islets is where we see our alpha and beta to where we control our blood sugars. How do we do that? To raise blood sugars, we add glucagon. So the alpha cells are producing glucagon, the hormone to put in the blood, to raise those blood sugar levels. So typically when you're not eating and you are low blood sugar, versus if I eat a lot, or I ate lunch right now, I have beta cells, remember the more abundant ones, they produce insulin to lower the blood sugars. So they have the opposite effect. And the liver plays a primary role in helping to store and release these sugars. So pancreatic islets, part of the endocrine, the hormone part of it, alpha and beta cells producing glucagon and insulin. This is the pancreas from an endocrine standpoint. We're focusing on the thyroid gland now, specifically 2 hormones, thyroxine and calcitonin. And we'll look at this from a histology view, looking at a microscope slide to understand these hormones. Remember, hormones tend to be what we call a cascade effect, that one hormone or one structure impacts another. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland directly impact the thyroid, and we use that through thyroid stimulating hormones. Remember that thyroid is that bow tie gland, that if I was to wear a bow tie with a tuxedo, it looks like a butterfly, so some people refer to it as the butterfly gland. And if I move over and look at histology of it, we're looking at all of these rounded structures within it that we call follicles. And we'll see this with different organs throughout the body, that we can organize them into functional units that we call follicles. These follicles are wrapped with cells, and these cells are called follicular cells. These follicular cells are actually simple cuboidal epithelium. Remember, there's 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And when we focus on epithelial tissue, the structure creates the function. Simple squamous epithelium, thin and flat cells allow for movement of materials. Oxygen, carbon dioxide. When we get into cuboidal, and they're more like a cube, we have more space within the cell that allows for areas of secretion. In this case, we're secreting hormones. So these cells, we often use this to look at simple cuboidal because it gives us that appearance to understand the basic structures. So releasing from those simple cuboidal is thyroxine. And thyroxine is that metabolic hormone that helps to increase the metabolic activity of our cells, to increase the energy, oxygen consumption, and then gives us that overall growth. As we get older and we lose the functionality of the thyroid, we tend to lose that metabolic activity. So our energy comes down. We tend to be colder as we get older, and there's a lot of contributing factors to that. But part of that is the hormones, including thyroxine, because it's part of the metabolism of our cells. When I added colloid through this is the basic gel-like material inside the follicle, and it's actually a precursor for the hormone of thyroxine. So thyroxine is part of the follicle. Outside of that follicle, I have parafollicular cells. So making up the follicle, follicular cells for thyroxine, and then I have parafollicular cells that are producing calcitonin. Calcitonin is important to control our calcium that's running through our blood. So as it increases, we have one hormone, parathyroid hormone, that's produced by the parathyroid that's on the posterior side of the thyroid. That increases the calcium that's flowing through the blood, versus calcitonin is decreasing it. So it's another example we call a negative feedback loop, that I have parathyroid hormone and calcitonin hormone that are working against each other to create a balance or equilibrium that we call homeostasis. Remember, our primary goal of the endocrine system is to have that homeostatic balance with hormones. So parafollicular cells producing calcitonin to control calcium. We know calcium is important for some of our membrane potentials and how we move things across surfaces of cells, and then also for our bone development as well. And then thyroxine, we said, was for energy and how we metabolize within the cells, and we do that through these follicular cells. So we focus primarily with thyroxine and calcitonin. These are the main hormones produced by the thyroid gland. We're covering the endocrine system, and we're focusing on the adrenal gland, specifically the outer cortex. Remember, the adrenal gland is on top of the kidneys. We call it the suprarenal gland as well, the adrenal gland, and it has two major regions. So it has the outside capsule, but then it has that outer cortex region, and then I have the inner medulla. And that medulla portion is my direct connection with the nervous system. And that's part of our autonomic nervous system, or fight or flight, that we call sympathetic nervous system, that's releasing our adrenaline, which is our norepinephrine, epinephrine. So that's the medulla. The focus for the endocrine system that we'll talk about is the cortex. So that outer region, the cortex, is actually organized into three what we call zones. And I abbreviated them here, but if I look at the outside of it from a histology point of view, the outside's the capsule, and then I have three regions or zones to just the cortex itself. Zona glomerulosa, then I have zona fasciculata, and then I have zona reticularis. After these three zones, then I'd hit the medulla. And when we look at the primary hormones that are secreted in each region, we start first within glomerulosa is aldosterone. So aldosterone is controlling a lot of our sodium levels. So specifically what it's doing is increasing the amount of sodium that's running through the bloodstream. This contributes when function with the kidneys when it comes into understanding our blood pressure. The more sodium we have within the blood, the more water we retain. That increases the volume, which increases our pressure, which increases our blood pressure. Sodium is very important for a lot of the mechanical movements of membrane potentials within our body. So aldosterone is controlling our sodium, but it's increasing the sodium levels within the bloodstream. Zona fasciculata is dealing with cortisol. So we'll have cortisol, cortisone. Cortisol we refer to as that stress hormone. It's got an anti-inflammatory effect to it, but it's controlling some of our glucose. It increases the blood glucose that's running through our body. So in conjunction with the pancreas, you have a control of glucose. But we often refer to this, like just we're talking about how I gray my hair, that it's that stress hormone that alerts us and makes us aware from a survival perspective. But we have a balance with that so we don't overstress and have that anxiety. So zona fasciculata, and then zona reticularis is referring to androgens. And androgens is primarily part of our reproduction or sexual characteristics when we think of things like the ability to produce testosterone or estrogen. So we talk about our testes and our ovaries. This helps with that cascade effect when we allow for that growth of our sexual characteristics. And androgens, we often will see this when we have androstenedione as a hormone, as a performance-enhancing drug that we mimic to produce to increase those characteristics that allow for my strength that occurs as they develop from puberty and beyond. So when we look at the adrenal gland, it does quite a bit, and specifically at the cortex. We learned that the medulla is part of our sympathetic nervous system. But then that cortex, we can further divide into our three zones, and we use this for sodium, glucose, and then part of our sexual characteristics from a reproductive standpoint. This is the adrenal gland or suprarenal gland focusing on just the cortex. We're looking at the pituitary gland, one of the main control centers of our body. Most texts will refer to it as the master gland because it's producing so much to control a lot of our growth and our reproduction. But it's based on a cascade effect. Remember, we said a cascade effect is often one part of the body talking to another. In this case, hormones that have an effect on other hormones in different areas of the body. But we start by even looking at the hypothalamus. If you remember the hypothalamus, hypo below the thalamus The hypothalamus has direct control over the pituitary, and we divide the pituitary in two main regions, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. I remember that the letter A is in anterior and adenohypophysis. So adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary. It has direct control from the hypothalamus through regulatory hormones. When you look at the anterior pituitary, we'll look at some of the hormones that are secreted, but they have a cascade effect, a lot to do with reproduction and then growth. When we look at the posterior side, the posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. And the two primary hormones that we see are secreted here are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone that we'll cover in a second. In the middle, you have what's called the pars intermedia. So pars intermedia is that middle section that you tend to see less as you get older, but it's that middle piece in between the two regions. When you look at histology, it tends to just to be a round ball, and the pituitary is only the size of about a pea. So when you look at a pituitary gland, it has a dark side and a light side. The dark side is the adenohypophysis. I remember the letter A for adenohypophysis and anterior, the letter A is in the word dark. So relative to the light, the neurohypophysis, all of this anterior side, this dark section, is the adenohypophysis versus the lighter section is the neurohypophysis. So histology is pretty straightforward to this. It just depends on the slide you have to view. But as you look at it as one round ball, dark side anterior, the light side posterior, adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. When we look at our hormones, just as the review, I broke down the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. Remember, the hypothalamus has hormones that are secreted to control the pituitary. If we start by just looking at the posterior side, remember we have this stalk called the infundibulum, this little funnel that allows the connection from hypothalamus to pituitary. So from the hypothalamus to the neurohypophysis, I have two hormones that are being secreted. The first one is called antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, is controlling how we maintain water within the body. And there's different mechanisms with the kidneys and how we control sodium, what contributes to that, including the adrenal gland and the cortex. But that ADH is contributing to how we function for water retention, telling the kidneys to keep water. Because remember, one of the functions of the kidneys is to eliminate excess water and excess salts. So when you have something like a diuretic, tea, alcohol, coffee, those are diuretics. They confuse this hormone or block its reception, and then your body will then actually urinate more water. So it confuses the hormone. So ADH is helping to retain water. The other hormone that's not listed here is oxytocin. Oxytocin, from a previous video, we learned is a reproductive hormone. Oxytocin helps during labor and delivery with uterine contractions. It also helps with contractions in the male when it comes to moving ejaculate along the urethra. So we have oxytocin as a reproductive hormone, ADH to retain water. These two hormones are produced in the hypothalamus and sent to the posterior pituitary, which we call the neurohypophysis. So two hormones from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and oxytocin. Then the pituitary on the anterior side, adenohypophysis, is regulated by the hypothalamus, but you can see all the hormones that it secretes that then have a cascade effect through the body. So growth hormone we see when we see performance enhancing drugs, and bodybuilders will use growth hormone because it promotes the growth of muscles and bones. Prolactin during reproduction for lactation, when we talk about apocrine glands and the mammary glands to produce that cellular function of milk to be released. We regulate the thyroid. When we talk about thyroxine, thyroxine for that metabolic energy is regulated by the pituitary. We talked about adrenal cortex hormones in a previous video. We talked about the 3 zones. We talked about aldosterone. We talked about cortisol. These are hormones that are regulated by the pituitary from the cortex side. When we regulate our reproduction, specifically the female side, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, is contributing to that cascade effect for estrogen to develop that follicle in a female. And then luteinizing hormone, we see this primarily again for the ovaries as we develop the corpus luteum to produce progesterone to prepare the uterus for implantation, but also for the testes as well because it's promoting that maturation of the sperm. So you can see when you look at the pituitary, it has a lot to do with overall growth and reproduction, and then the way it controls the water flowing through our body. So when we look at the pituitary and we look at the histology, pretty basic when it comes to the 2 sides, adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. But then understanding the hormones contributing to the release and that cascade effect of the body, you can see why it's called the master gland.